Sam Cooke was standing in the wings of the Apollo Theater in Harlem, waiting to go on. He had performed hundreds of times. He had sung in churches since before he could read. He had crossed over from gospel to pop and had sold records that played on every radio station in America. None of that mattered right now, because the audience on the other side of that curtain was an Apollo audience, and an Apollo audience was something different entirely. Sam Cooke had everything to prove the night he first walked onto the Apollo stage. He had crossed over from gospel to pop, had left the church music behind for the mainstream, and had been told by people who knew the Apollo audience that they might not forgive him for it, that the Apollo crowd had a long memory and specific expectations, that being famous on the radio was not the same as being accepted in that room. He had been warned. He had been told exactly what he was walking into. And now he was standing in the wings, listening to the sound of 2,000 people who had not yet decided what they thought of him, and the curtain was about to open. There was a stagehand at the Apollo that night, an older man named William who had worked the theater for 20 years and had seen everyone come through those wings. He had watched Ella, he had watched James, he had watched people who were going to be legends before they knew they were going to be legends. He looked at Sam Cooke standing in the wings and said one thing. He said, "They're gonna love you or they're gonna eat you alive. There's nothing in between at the Apollo." Sam said, "Which do you think it'll be?" William looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I've seen both. I know which one you are." He didn't say which. The Apollo audience was not like other audiences. They came to be moved, but they could not be fooled. They had heard the best. They had heard Dinah Washington and Ray Charles and Little Richard and every other voice that the 1950s had produced. They knew what real sounded like, and they knew with an accuracy that no critic could match when something was being performed and when something was being felt. You could not fake it at the Apollo. The room would not allow it. The Apollo Theater had opened its doors to black performers and black audiences in 1934, at a time when most of the entertainment venues in New York were either segregated or closed entirely to black artists. It had become, in the decades since, the most important stage in black American music. Not the most famous, that depended on who you asked, but the most important, the most honest. The stage where what mattered was not what you had done before, or who had signed you, or how your records were selling. What mattered was what you did in that room, in front of those people, on that night. The Wednesday amateur night shows had become legendary, the weekly ritual in which unknown performers came to the Apollo and faced an audience that had no obligation to be kind. Acts that the crowd approved of were allowed to continue. Acts they didn't were stopped, sometimes gently, sometimes not. The crowd had booed people who later became famous. They had also discovered people who later became famous. Their judgment was not infallible, but it was honest. And in a music industry full of people whose enthusiasm was calibrated to what they needed from you, honest judgment was rare enough to be worth something. The regular shows operated differently. The headliners were known quantities, invited because of their reputation, expected to deliver. But the Apollo crowd held headliners to the same standard they held everyone else. Fame bought you nothing in that room except the particular pressure of having been expected to be extraordinary. If you were extraordinary, they let you know. If you weren't, they let you know that too. Sam knew all of this. He had been told by people who had played the Apollo, by musicians and singers who had come through those wings and faced that audience and come out the other side changed by the experience one way or another. He had absorbed the stories. He had understood from early in his career that the Apollo was the room that mattered in a specific and irreplaceable way. He had waited until he felt ready. Standing in the wings on this particular night, listening to the crowd on the other side of the curtain, he was not entirely sure he had waited long enough.
The thing that made the Apollo crowd difficult was not hostility, it was standards. They had been listening to the best black musicians in America for 20 years, had sat in those seats while Ella Fitzgerald found her voice, and Billie Holiday broke hearts, and James Brown invented an entirely new way of being on a stage. They had developed, through that listening, a precise and unforgiving sense of what excellence sounded like and what it felt like to be in the presence of it. They could hear the difference between a singer who was technically accomplished and a singer who was actually doing something, who had something real in the voice, something that came from somewhere true and went somewhere true. Sam Cooke had crossed over from gospel to pop. This was the fact that complicated everything. Gospel music in the black church was not entertainment, it was something else, closer to testimony, closer to prayer, the specific use of a voice to reach towards something that ordinary language couldn't reach. When Sam took that voice and pointed it at the pop market, at the crossover audience, at the radio stations that would play his records for white listeners, he had made a choice, a deliberate, considered, profitable choice. And the Apollo crowd was going to weigh in on that choice tonight, whether he was ready for them to or not. The question they were going to answer was specific. Had he kept the thing that made the voice real? Whether the crossing over had cost him something essential, whether what was left after the pop arrangements and the crossover singles and the carefully managed public image was still the same voice that had moved people in gospel concerts before he had ever thought about radio stations and record labels. Sam stood in the wings for 11 minutes before the curtain opened. He knew because he counted, not the whole time, just when the counting became necessary, when the waiting became the kind of waiting that required something to hold on to. The sound of the audience on the other side of the curtain was constant and specific. 2,000 people finding their seats, greeting each other, settling into the particular collective energy of an Apollo crowd preparing to render its verdict. He thought about the churches, about Clarksdale, Mississippi, and the specific quality of a congregation deciding in the first moments of a performance whether to receive what was being offered. He had learned to read rooms and churches before he had ever stood on a stage, had learned that the difference between a room that was with you and a room that was waiting was something you felt before you heard it. He was feeling it now, through the curtain, through the noise, through all the years and all the performances between that boy in Mississippi and this man in Harlem. The Apollo crowd was waiting. He was ready. He was not ready. Both things were true simultaneously, which was perhaps the most honest description of what it felt like to be standing in those wings at that particular moment, about to walk into the most important room of his career. William said, "They're calling you." Sam straightened his jacket, and the curtain opened.
Sam Cooke walked onto the Apollo stage, and the room gave him what it gave every performer at the beginning, a moment of suspended judgment. Not warmth exactly, not hostility, simply attention. 2,000 people looking at him and waiting for him to tell them who he was. He opened his mouth, and he sang. The first song was careful, not tentative, but controlled. Sam was a craftsman of the highest order, and he understood that you did not give an Apollo audience everything in the first song. You gave them enough to stay interested. You gave them the outline of what was possible and let them lean forward toward it. He could feel the room listening, the particular quality of 2,000 people who are paying close attention and have not yet decided how they feel. It was not warm, it was not cold. It was the specific temperature of 2,000 people who were waiting to be convinced. He could feel himself trying, could feel the effort of it, the particular tension of a performer who is aware of the gap between what they are doing and what they are capable of doing. He had felt this before, the awareness of reaching rather than arriving, of performing rather than being. It was the feeling William had described, the trying to prove something, present in every note, making the voice smaller than it was. He noticed it happen, and in noticing it, something shifted. The second song was different. Somewhere in the middle of the first, William's words had reached him in the way that the right words sometimes reach you when you most need them, not as advice to be followed, but as a key turning in a lock. Stop trying to prove something. Sam felt the shift happen in real time, felt the place where the craft stopped managing and the voice took over. He did not make it happen, it simply happened, the way it sometimes did on the best nights, the way it had happened in churches in Mississippi when he was a child, and the music stopped being about performance and started being about something else entirely, about reaching, about the specific act of putting something real into the air and trusting that it would find what it was looking for. The Apollo crowd felt it happen. It was not loud at first, not the roar that comes at the end of a great song, the applause and the cheering. It was quieter than that, a settling, a collective shift in the way 2,000 people were sitting in their seats, the particular physical language of an audience that has stopped waiting and started receiving. Sam could feel it from the stage, had learned to read it over hundreds of performances, and when he felt it, something in him that had been tight since he walked into the building that evening finally released. He gave them everything after that, song after song, building the set the way he knew how to build a set, pacing it, shaping it, finding the moments where he could reach and the moments where he could rest and let the audience carry some of the weight. The Apollo crowd carried it. They were extraordinary when they were with you, generous and precise and completely present in the way of people who have decided you are real and are allowing themselves to be moved by it. They responded to the quiet songs with quiet attention and the loud songs with something that filled the room and came back to Sam on the stage as energy he could use, a conversation between the voice and the room, each responding to the other, building something together that neither could have built alone. When Sam finished, the Apollo Theater gave him what it gave very few people. Not polite applause, not the obligatory response of an audience fulfilling its social contract. Something louder and more specific, the sound of 2,000 people who had come expecting to be shown something and had been shown it and were now expressing without reservation that they had received it. The approval of the Apollo was not subtle. It did not need to be translated or interpreted. It arrived in the body before it arrived in the mind, the way certain kinds of truth arrive, immediately, completely, without ambiguity.
Sam Cooke walked off the Apollo stage and found William standing in the wings where he had left him. The old stagehand looked at Sam for a long moment, the particular look of someone who has seen exactly what he expected to see and is taking a moment to acknowledge it before moving on. Then he nodded, just once, the nod of a man who has been right about something and is confirming it quietly rather than announcing it. Sam said, "Which one was it?" William said, "What do you think?" Sam thought about the room, about the shift he had felt in the second song, the moment when the trying stopped and the voice simply went where it needed to go, about the sound the crowd had made when they felt it happen, that settling, that collective shift, the quality of 2,000 people who had stopped waiting and started receiving, about the sound at the end, that particular sound, the specific quality of approval from people who did not give it cheaply and knew the difference between what they were giving and what they withheld. He said, "I think they loved me." William said, "Yes." Then he picked up his equipment and went back to work, because that was what William did. He had seen hundreds of people come through those wings. He had watched them wait and worry and perform and succeed and fail. His job was not to celebrate them. His job was to work the theater, and the theater had another show tomorrow. Sam stood in the wings for a moment longer. He could still hear the audience on the other side of the curtain, the specific sound of 2,000 people dispersing, taking what they had received out into the Harlem night and carrying it home with them. He had been performing for most of his life. He had been in rooms where the response was extraordinary, but he had never been in a room quite like that one. The Apollo did not just tell you that you were good. It told you something more specific and more useful. It told you that the thing at the center of you was real, and that no amount of crossing over or commerce or career management had diminished it. He had come to the Apollo with everything to prove. He left with something different, not just the knowledge that he had proven it, but the understanding of what proving it had required. The voice was real. The Apollo had told him so, and the Apollo did not lie. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe. Every day we tell the stories behind the music, the nights that tested the legends and the rooms that told the truth. Hit the like button if you believe that real talent cannot be hidden, that the right room will always find it and name it. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had a moment when you found out once and for all that the thing you had was real? Because Sam Cooke had that moment at the Apollo, and it changed everything that came after. We'll see you in the next one.